Let's face it, people didn't really like how Game of Thrones ended. Before the show's finale, many people were calling it the greatest show of all time. But just a couple episodes in the last season ruined it for most people. And now it's called the show with the worst ending of all time. And can you blame them? I mean, I wouldn't. In fact, it's quite difficult for me to imagine a worse ending for the show. It's like the showrunners made a list of all the worst possible endings and just went for the worst one they could think of. But, like they say, all's well that ends well. Wait, scratch that. You wouldn't actually say that about Game of Thrones. Anyway, the good thing is that House of the Dragon, the prequel to Game of Thrones, has completely changed how people feel about the Westeros universe. While we don't yet know exactly how the show will end, we do know one thing. The show has given Game of Thrones a new lease on life. In House of the Dragon, we're introduced to the most intricate characters. These screenwriters successfully blurred the lines between hero and villain even better than was done in Game of Thrones. I mean, look at Daemon Targaryen, for example. Is he a good guy? Is he a bad guy? Nobody knows. And more importantly, nobody cares. It certainly took us on a trip back, or shall I say forward, to Jaime Lannister and his similar antics in Game of Thrones. But it's somehow even better. Game of Thrones had a good build-up for the Kingslayer, but eventually dashed all of our hopes. Just like the Kingslayer and his lover were dashed to death by tumbling bricks. The first thing that makes House of the Dragon so good that it makes us forget all about the horridness of that final Game of Thrones season is its directing. And hats off to Miguel Sapochnik, who's a major part of the directing of the show behind the camera. Yes, Game of Thrones had great directing too, but poor writing and rushed storytelling brought the show to its knees. And like that was not enough, insanely poor character arcs also held the Game of Thrones finale in a chokehold. Right from the beginning of Game of Thrones, we're reminded all too fondly how no one is safe from a brutal death. Surely, Eddard Stark and King Joffrey serve as prime examples of this, with the latter choked to death with poison, coughing up blood at his own wedding till he turned an unhealthy shade of bluish purple, and the latter beheaded in the 9th episode of the very first season, an execution ordered by none other than King Joffrey. Unfortunately, the show messed this up by having the most disappointing deaths in the last season. Take for instance Queen Cersei herself. With the pacing of past seasons and the buildup of bittersweet hatred for Cersei Lannister, one would expect her death to be a glorious scene with all of the warriors of the Unsullied tearing her apart, skin from bone, and then feeding her remains to the Drogon. Instead, she ends up crushed beneath King's Landing alongside Jaime Lannister in an off-screen death that left viewers dissatisfied. The House of the Dragon is set off to fix all of these problems with Game of Thrones and add all the elements that made the original series a blockbuster. The first element that guaranteed the success of House of the Dragon is actually in the name, and that element is dragons. There are so many stories in the Song of Fire and Ice narrative to choose from, and the fact that the story chosen had as many as a dozen dragons showed us that HBO knew what its audience wanted. The original Game of Thrones would never have been as successful without dragons, and the show only had 3. Now imagine just how successful a prequel with 16 dragons would be. Aside from just having dragons, the show also had full-scale dragon fights, an element that Game of Thrones sorely lacked. And while there weren't many dragon bouts in the first season, the show itself is centered around a civil war fought with dragons, so viewers can expect extravagant dragon fights as the rest of the show goes on. That is certainly something that viewers of Game of Thrones will want to see. Daenerys Targaryen is probably the most important character in all of Game of Thrones. The show took us through her life and we all watched her grow from a scared teenager to the most powerful leader in the show's world. And everyone anticipated her eventual victory over the Lannisters, but no one foresaw the nature of how it would come. Daenerys' equivalent in House of the Dragon is the duo of Alicent and Rhaenyra. In the Song of Fire and Ice books, the narratives of Rhaenyra and Alicent aren't really fleshed out, and both of them come off really poorly. However, the show has taken a different approach to telling the story by making them sympathetic, dynamic characters. Rhaenyra and Alicent aren't just two women fighting for power. They are two friends with conflicting relationships and incentives. And let's not forget, Game of Thrones wasn't particularly kind to its female characters. Daenerys, Sansa, and a host of others suffered graphic sexual humiliation at the hands of men. And that was really unnerving to see, even though it added to the complexities of the characters and their stories. The good thing about House of the Dragon is that women needn't be so humiliated to experience character development. The female characters are robust and complete, even without the range of human suffering that the women in Game of Thrones suffer. The sexual freedom that Rhaenyra enjoys is something alien to the women in Game of Thrones, and it's a breath of fresh air to the cinematic world of Westeros. The magic of House of the Dragon lies in the fact that it made the world of Westeros appealing again. When Game of Thrones ended, many people, including the makers of this video, didn't want to hear about the Targaryens and their nonsense anymore. Hearing about Westeros just made us rue what could have been, and we imagined so many different endings that could have done justice to one of the most important shows in pop culture, and we were disappointed at the turn that the show took. However, House of the Dragon changed all that. A lot of people didn't really want a prequel, but the first few episodes of House of the Dragon managed to change many minds. The show took on a life of its own and created a new world that Game of Thrones lovers could fall in love with. And no matter what happens, the one thing we can all be sure of is that House of the Dragon will never drop a nasty surprise bombshell on us as an ending. It won't be like Game of Thrones in that respect because we already sort of know how it's going to end. The story of House of the Dragon is already known. If you've read the books, you actually already know how it ends. And this will hopefully restrict the showrunners from pulling any nasty tricks on us. What this means in the long run is that no matter what happens, the ending will feel like a natural progression of the show. It won't seem rushed as we would already have seen it coming from a mile away. And that was one of the biggest problems with Game of Thrones ending. Nobody saw it coming. It seemed like Daenerys suffered an aneurysm that altered her entire character. Her behavior wasn't the one of the Daenerys we knew and loved. And while one may be able to rationalize the ending in hindsight, it's important to say that the showrunners didn't do enough to foreshadow the ending. Maybe if they had done that, it would have felt a little bit more rational. But it didn't, and that was the great sin of Game of Thrones. The good thing is that it's unlikely that we're going to suffer the same fate with House of the Dragon. For one, we already kind of know what's coming, even if we don't necessarily know the journey there. This means we'll be able to make sense of the characters' decisions as the show progresses. And while we may not eventually like the ending, it won't be a surprise. In the end, the House of the Dragon has truly renewed our interest in the amazing world of Westeros. And now we want to see more stories and fall in love with new characters. What happens with Jon Snow at the Wall? What happens with Bran? What about the First Men? How did they come to be? And what about Aegon the Conqueror? What about stories of old Valyria? This world of thrones is so large that one could tell infinite stories. And it's just as well because we love it and we want to hear infinite stories. And if you loved this video, don't forget to smash the like and subscribe buttons. Goodbye and stay safe.